Hi, everyone. My name's Janet Mann, and I am delighted to be here and discussing this gorgeous film with two outstanding marine mammal scientists who are examining whale communication and a very exciting topic. And both Drew and Megan, the producer and director of this beautiful film. And I have a lot of questions, and I'm going to start with Drew. And to ask, like, how did you conceive of this film, and how did you decide on Michelle and Ellen as your core, like, storytellers of the film?
Thanks, Janet. I first fell in love with the science. I was reading journals and books and popular articles and kind of everything I could get my hands on, and quickly realized that the larger picture it was all painting was just extraordinary, and reminded me of the best science fiction movies that I'd ever seen and books. And it occurred to me that the people out there in the field doing the work must be having extraordinary experiences themselves. If I was having this much fun reading about it, the people out there on boats must be just having the most amazing experiences. So I first met Mish, actually, oddly through a mutual friend who was a journalist in Alaska who wanted to do a story about her, but then it fell through and she was really bummed out. So she connected me with Mish, and we started talking, and eventually she said, you should come to the Marine Mammal Conference and let's meet, and you can meet a bunch of scientists there. So anyway, over the next couple of years, I'd gone out with Mish on her pilot study in Alaska. I'd met a whole slew of scientists. And at that point, it took me like years to understand what Michelle was actually doing and to wrap my head around the larger concept of what she was doing and its implications. So by the time I caught up to her, I sort of realized where, maybe what the other half needed to be to tell the whole story of what it is to be a field researcher, and also the larger story of this work being done on humpbacks and communication and culture. Enter Ellen, who through a long series of connecting with her colleagues, ended up speaking with her. And when I learned the story of Ellen's research, it was just like the other half of this massive story. Of how we, are barely scratching at the surface what we understand about humpback communication and culture. And so it just seemed that Mish was interested in this singular sound that they make that might be foundational to how they maintain lifelong relationships. And then here's Ellen, who's looking at a lot of sounds that they make and that they are making on and passing on to each other on such a massive scale. So just in terms of storytelling, there was a real elegance to it. There's a real complementary aspect to Mish focusing on one sound and Ellen focusing on this like large geographic region and trying to understand what they're all doing at once. So that's kind of how it worked out. Everything else just kind of fell into place as it does in documentary.
So I thought that maybe it was intentional that you selected two women because women have traditionally been underrepresented in this field as scientists, and especially, being out in the water. These were, Michelle's team was an all female team as well. Was that an element in your decision, or was that just an afterthought? Well, the great scientists happen to be women, so, or was it, I want to tell the women's story?
No, it was definitely the latter. It was definitely, I think we all and the team cared mostly about the quality of scientists who are going out into the field and spending a lot of time out at sea in order to do the work that they're doing. And it so happened that Michelle and her women, and it so happened that they're young women, and but that was never an outright thing that we were seeking. It was first and foremost excellent scientists who I really enjoy spending time with, because that's really important when you're making a film and going out into the field, and who trust me and I trust them. And those are the criteria.
So, turning to Ellen and Michelle about this, because there were many elements of that story that got personal in terms of being women in the field. You both had discussions about this, both Ellen, about your relationship with your partner and leaving, and also about your mother, who wasn't allowed on boats. And as a marine mammal scientist, sometimes I wonder if women are still allowed on boats, as how we get treated. And then also Michelle, the discussions about the relationships as well, and what it's like to be women out there, and how you can't fail, especially where and how you get treated if you fail, if your engine fails and everyone's like, oh, bloody women, messed this up, kind of thing. So I'd like both of you to respond to that, what that was like.
Yeah, I can go ahead and jump in on that. You mentioned that I had an all-female field team, and at one point in my life that was not by design. When I first started doing field work, I broadly recruited students to come with me, and whomever applied would get equal consideration. And what was interesting to me is that when I first ran my big field season, I was looking for a total of 16 technicians, which was a lot. I had about 70 people apply, and only 3 of them were men. And then I went later to the Marine Mammal Conference, my first Marine Mammal Conference, which is in San Francisco. And I noticed lots and lots and lots of young women. And then I started watching poster presentations, lots of young women. Then I started watching talks, and there were fewer women. And then I started looking at keynotes. And in that particular year, I'm not sure if there was any women. And there was very obviously this loss of scientific, of the female scientific mind in marine mammal science, that as we sort of progressed in the field, we lost that. And that was really troubling to me. And then when I started working with other graduate students when I was in grad school, Natalie, who's in the film in particular, is a really exceptional scientist. And I saw her sort of get systematically overlooked repeatedly. And then the same thing with Leanna. I saw her consistently overlooked. Now, I won't necessarily speculate and say, oh, it's just because they're women. They're both sort of docile personalities as well. And so for this project, I said I wanted to bring the best scientists I could think of into the field with me. And I want to make a commitment to making sure that these are women. We were dangerously close to losing Leanna in the field of marine mammal science from a lack of opportunity. And so we ended up creating this field team intentionally to do the best work we could possibly do. I never could have succeeded with this study without them, but also to create a platform for retaining women in science. And that ended up being a really personal thing for me when Drew came to film this work. It didn't sort of occur to me at the time when I was building my field team, oh, this guy's going to make a movie and that's going to be important for women and girls. But when I saw the film, I realized this is the first time that I have seen an all-female field team on screen. And that's something I'm actually really proud of. Yeah, so that wasn't something that I started out in my career thinking was going to be a really important thing. But when you have 3 women on a boat and something goes wrong and you can solve the problem, and then somebody can put that in a film that people can see, that's something I was really happy to participate in.
That's great. I often have all-female teams as well, so mostly all-female teams. So glad to hear this. Ellen.
That was an amazing answer, Michelle. I mean, I guess growing up, I, was had spent a lot of time, playing in rock pools with my mum and hearing her passion for the ocean and sort of being part of that. Being from New Zealand, we're always at the coast or always in rivers, and so there was a lot of those aspects that came through. And then as I was going through university, different role models, and a lot of them were not female. So I was glad that I could participate in the film with Drew and just, talk about the research that I'm doing and showcase the research first and foremost. But I also feel that I had a bit of a responsibility. When I was growing up, I would always watch documentaries about wildlife and hear about all these amazing stories. And all of the presenters that I saw were men. They were all male. It was, and I think having this opportunity, I sort of was quite conscious about that. You would act a bit more as a role model. And when I was on film and I was just doing my thing, like that's what I do in the field. That's what I look like in the field. And that year I was training a PhD student, Alex. And so he's more on the musical side. So he hadn't been in the field before. So we were going through a lot of stuff, just talking about the equipment, and as you would have seen in the film. But I visit multiple different teams during my PhD. So one of the field teams I get to join is usually an all-woman team, and that's fantastic. And others are not. So I have different, during my PhD, some of the PIs were female at the different field sites and some were male. And so I have this really interesting perspective for people who do the same thing differently. So lots of different teams. So yeah, I was definitely conscious when we were doing the film, and that you would be a bit more potentially as a role model, but also just be honest what it's like in the field. I think that's sometimes romanticized what going into the field is. There's been comments that, oh, I'm going to the field, I'm going to go have some cocktails. Like, that's what I'm doing. I'm like, no, I'm going to do proper science, hardcore science. This is hard. We're going to be up at 5:30 a.m. We're going to get out. We're going to get on the boat. We're going to go out and we're going to get those recordings and we're going to get the data. And then we're going to come back and we're going to do the data, make sure all the data is entered. We've got to cook dinner. So it was sort of unromanticizing this whole, let's go to a tropical island aspect as well.
Yeah. One of the things I really liked about the film, perhaps Drew can comment on this, was the much more realistic portrayal of the field work, and and a lot of the tedium where you're just like waiting around and waiting around and waiting around. And I wanted to ask either Drew or Megan in their perspective on this, because I also really liked, for example, showing, having Ellen listen, but there's no whale in view. It's always like you have to show the whale close up. And the same with Michelle, that you could see there were whales in the distance. Which is often what the field scientist is experiencing. It wasn't, we need the close up of like the eyeball or the money shot all the time of the whales right there, which gives people the wrong idea about field work, because they think, in my case, they think dolphins are like leaping over the bow constantly, saying hello, coming in for a cuddle, ridiculous stuff. So maybe Drew, like in terms of how the perspective of how you shot it from the researchers, the scientist perspective, I'd like to hear some more about that from.
Yeah, it was when I started meeting a number of researchers before Misha and I started filming together. It was actually, the thing about whale scientists is that they're generally pretty savvy when it comes to cameras and like film crews and stuff, because they're often asked to, be part of nature documentaries and stuff. And I just kept having to, like, even when I was on boats with folks, I kept having to, they're like, you're missing the whale. I'm like, no, like you're the one I'm interested in. I was more interested in filming their reactions to what was happening rather than the whale itself, which was really hard for me, by the way, because I also wanted to look at the whale when it would appear and do stuff. But it was always about the perspective of the field biologist. It was always, and how they experience it. There's a reason why we don't go underwater in the film until I think it's the last 10 minutes of the film. The film had to be in service of Ellen and Michelle's perspectives. And also it's more realistic. It is an acoustic work. It is, primarily an acoustic experience for them as well. And that is how Ellen and Michelle are experiencing the whales primarily, is acoustically. And so I should have said this in the introduction, but I really hope everyone watched it with the best sound possible, because the film, as visually pleasing as it is, I'm even more proud of how it sounds. And so, to me, it was what are they experiencing? Are they, they never go in the water, they're in the boats, and they're listening into these incredibly elusive creatures, but they're omnipresent acoustically once you throw a hydrophone in there. Well, Ellen, sometimes you couldn't really hear them, but yeah.
I would love to comment on that actually, because when Drew and I first started talking, it was not because I was under consideration to be in the film. It was just because I was kind of low hanging fruit for someone who would sit on the phone for many hours and talk, wax poetic about philosophy and biology and really want to talk deeply about whales. Our first conversation, Drew and I were on the phone for 2.5 hours. And I said to him, I'm like, acoustics is wonderful. I don't really know if it's going to translate to film. Like, I don't see much when I'm out there. If I'm doing my job well, the whale will never know I'm there. And that is always my goal. Now, this particular project feels more interactive. And I think that that's a bit of a misnomer. My work certainly is not trying to interact with the whale. My work is trying to understand what the whale does in its natural environment. So Janet, to your point that it's not dolphins leaping over the boat, if all goes well, I'm looking at a whale that's 1 kilometer away that is doing exactly what it does in its natural environment. And when Drew said he wanted to film that, I was like, you might want to think about what that really means. And when he came out with me in 2018, another field season where everything went wrong, we worked from a lighthouse there, and you can sit on the island and you can hear whales breathing from many kilometers away. It's a really unique soundscape. And I remember watching him have that experience and how poignant and important that was, to be standing on land and to be able to listen to an animal that you could just barely see and still feel the magnitude of its presence. So I was a little surprised when that was Drew's turning point, but it was also incredibly helpful to know that if we didn't see a whale that day, that wasn't going to make him grumpy, which is also good because we were living together and he rarely got grumpy.
You were never low-hanging fruit, Michelle, for the record. But that was like one of the most formative experiences, certainly for the film, but on a personal level. To hear the sounds of whales breathing in every direction, and it's so far away that there's no blow, like the blow's gone by the time you can kind of like figure out where it came from. And you're right. That was the most formative. I mean, that was the most formative experiences of my life, to be honest. It's one of the most incredible, which is why maybe you should rewatch the movie if you didn't get to watch it with the best sound possible. It's just, we tried to capture that. Yeah, it's incredible.
But I think also too, in the sort of interludes where we're trying to give a little bit of this foundational understanding about whales and how whales kind of work physically to try and build for the audience the foundation of some of the things that Michelle and Ellen already kind of innately understand, that auditory experience is another piece of it, that they are not primarily, their primary perceptive experience is not visual. Their primary perceptive experience is auditory. And so it was important, I think, to have that be a key part of it. And, Drew and I are both like such geeks over sound design. Like, it was totally a fun thing to work on. And we just kept saying to ourselves, we were so excited to get into that piece of it. And I remember, one of the first times in post-production, we listened to like a cleaned up recording of some whale sounds. It was just like, I think I played it 5 times. Like, I played it and then I played it again and then I played it again, because I was just like, I cannot wait for people to enter this world with us.
Actually, one of my favorite images was when you used, it was dark with using light to show the whales kind of communicating back and forth with each other. And I was wondering like how you did that and what you did there, and sort of why you did it. I loved it. Maybe any one of you could answer that.
Yeah, it was, that was I forget when that concept came about. I feel like that was a pretty early on thing, Megan, and like development, even when we were kind of talking through it. Yeah, this desire to because we really wanted to show audiences water and whales and show things that there's plenty of other films out there that cover the science of whales, what we understand about them, and field research, et cetera. But I wanted to do this completely differently and not take anything for granted. There's a reason why we have these very artistic shots of water out at sea as well. Wanted to show everything in a way that hopefully you haven't seen before and experienced before. And early on, there was this idea of wanting to try and translate with a lot of poetic license what it's like to experience sound as your primary sense. Sound is not our primary sense, it's vision. And so we worked with an animator, Duncan Elms, to translate what would these sounds look like for us. It's not a clean translation at all. And so Ellen's narration kind of helps hopefully like kind of blow your mind in terms of how sound as your primary sense in a fluid environment could actually change your sense, your perception of time and space, because it's very different than our experience. So that's where that concept came from.
Yeah, that was great. I want to make sure, because we only have a few minutes left, and I really wanted to talk a lot more about the communication of whales themselves, which you have these sort of very different perspectives. Like the whoops were fascinating, and the idea that they might have individually distinctive whoop sounds, and also on sort of Ellen's side of the cultural transmission of song across the globe, and how that, and the discovery of a new call at the end of towards the end of the film. But specifically, since it's been primarily, I know that there are sounds that humpback whales, the females give, with their calves. But most of the song, it's all about males, right? And they're not the ones that you'd expect to have the relationships. So I'd like you to, both of you, to kind of talk about that. And the whoop call, like, was that both sexes? And the fact that you were in different, like, you were in the feeding grounds, not in the breeding grounds. So I want you to address some of that in terms of the whales biology and their communication. Either one of you can start.
I'm being volunteered to go first, it seems. So I guess with the film, I've been working on humpback song and song culture for about 15 years now. So it started at the start of my PhD, and then looked into song transmission, and then sort of went off and did a different postdoc, and then came back to it. So we've got a lot of information that we've published over the last 15 years, sort of condensed into one film. So trying to translate all of the science through one season is what we were trying to do here. So what we've seen is the songs of each population are learnt and then passed on to the neighbouring population. So in the South Pacific, songs appear in the east coast of Australia population. They take over. So a whale learns a completely new song introduced from somewhere else, and all the population do this, and then it's passed on to the next population and the next and the next. And I'd only really looked across to French Polynesia, which is in the center of the South Pacific. And I spent a couple of years as a postdoc trying to work out what was happening with the song there. Because sometimes these song changes, which we call song revolutions, because they just throw their current song out the window and learn this new one, they don't take, and we don't know why. So we've got a lot of unanswered questions where it comes to French Polynesian song, and it's smack bang in the middle of the Central Pacific. And then we've got this other large population on the west coast of South America. And we're trying to understand whether that cultural transmission continues to sweep all the way across the South Pacific and into Ecuador and Colombia and that west coast of South American population, or whether it could possibly come back the other way. And that's what we're actually looking into right now. We're doing the analysis right now, actually comparing the songs from both sides, from French Polynesia with my collaborators in Ecuador. So we're actually trying to answer the question of whether there is song sharing, whether we have acoustic contact between these very distant populations, maybe because they're mingling in Antarctica when they go back down to feed. There may be some population overlap down there, and there's some photo ID and genetic data to suggest there's occasional transmission, but it's these really broad scale, big picture song transmission networks that I'm really interested in, and trying to work out how does an individual whale change its song, and why would it change its song? What's driving the, what's driving the system? Why would a male need to switch? And those sort of aspects, really digging down into that.
And why would it go west to east is the...
Exactly. I mean, at the moment, it looks, we're hypothesizing that it has something to do with differences in population size. So at the moment, it seems that song goes from a large population, which is on the east coast of Australia, and it gets passed through smaller populations. And then suddenly we've got a large population. So if that is the direction is from large to small, then you would expect it to go from large in the east there across west to a small. So it depends if it's a single directional transmission, or whether it has something to do with these population structures and differences in structure. So that's what we're starting to nut out, and also do some really cool cultural evolutionary models to look at the dynamics of the whole system.
That's a fascinating idea. Michelle, maybe you can say something about the whoops. And,
Yeah.
I mean,
I can, and actually I think that Ellen and I's research is actually not as far away from each other as it sounds, because what didn't make it into the film is the fact that a whoop is a very, very common sound produced in song. You hear whoops in song all the time. So they're not two separate things. And we're also just finishing up analyzing data, looking at individual variation in these calls. And I feel quite confident that not like signature whistles, there's not sort of a chosen specific sound type to identify each individual, but in the same way that you can identify people whom you're familiar with by the sound of their voice. And if I were to record your voice and make a spectrogram of you saying hello, and then make a spectrogram of me saying hello, there'd be a lot of structural overlap, but there's going to be differences there that are indicative of our biology, the shape of my vocal cords, how deep a breath that I take, and that gives me a unique voice. And the science is showing us that also gives humpback whales this unique concept of voice when they produce this one call. And so it might not be as far-fetched as we think to say that you can learn a lot about an individual from the sound of their voice. Possibly that has something to do with cultural transmission. Possibly that does give us information about relationship fidelity. One of the big differences between what Ellen studies and what I do, aside from all the obvious monumental differences, is the calls that I'm interested in are produced across age and sex class and migration. So the whoop call is produced by very young whales, possibly even neonates are producing a call that sounds very whoop-like. Female whales produce it, male whales produce it, old whales produce it, breeding whales make this sound, foraging whales make this sound. And so this one sound is apparently fundamental. And then unlike song, which varies by populations and moves very slowly, or not, I guess not always slowly, whoop calls can be found in every population for which we have looked for them, from Antarctica to Alaska to the Gulf of Maine to South Africa. Everywhere that we have recorded humpback whale vocalizations, this call hasn't just been present, it has been predominant. And this was really, it makes this work more important than just saying, why do whales call? Really what we're saying is, how do whales interact with each other? What is this system of communication? And given that they can produce possibly, close to an infinite combination of different sound types, given how vocally plastic they are and that they can be ordered, why does this one persist? Why is it so important? And so what I would love to do someday, and I think I've mentioned this to Ellen, or maybe I've just dreamt about it, is look at the role of the whoop call in song, and whether or not that call type ends up having some sort of predominance, and what is the relationship in the interface there. So I think that it's true that our work really does bookend one another, and that the things that are interesting to me are potentially important to the really impressive work that Ellen's trying to do on a much larger scale.
Thank you. That was just incredible, just hearing you talk about the work that you're doing. And I am so delighted to have two wonderful marine mammal scientists being featured in this film and showing such incredible work that was beautifully conceived of and shot by Drew and Megan. And I think many generations of scientists young scientists and young women will watch this film and be inspired by it. And I can't wait to see what the next chapter is in your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janet.